The letter arrived on my 18th birthday, delivered by a lawyer who looked like he had driven through 3 counties just to find me at Riverside Children's Home. I remember staring at the official seal, my hands trembling as I read the words that would change everything. Kevin Cox, a farmer I had never heard of, had left me his entire legacy: 300 acres of farmland, a house, equipment, livestock, and enough money to make it all work. The catch was simple, yet impossible to believe. He claimed to be my grandfather. Standing in that sterile hallway where I had spent the last 16 years, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Nobody had ever come for me. Not when I was 2 and crying for parents I could barely remember. Not when I turned 10 and still believed someone might want me. Not when I aged out of the system at 16 and moved to the transitional housing program. But now, this stranger had reached from beyond the grave to offer me something I had stopped dreaming about: a place to belong. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. Your support means everything as we dive into this incredible journey. The lawyer, Dennis Thompson, sat across from me in the small meeting room where they usually held family conferences for kids who still had families to confer with. His briefcase was worn leather, the kind that spoke of decades spent handling other people's most important moments. He pulled out documents that felt heavier than their paperweight suggested. Kevin Cox had been watching me from a distance for years, Dennis explained. My grandmother, Sharon Scott, had been Kevin's daughter. She had run away at 17, pregnant and scared, cutting all ties with her family. Kevin had spent decades searching for her, only to discover she had died when I was barely 2 years old. It took him years more to find me in the system, and by then, he was too sick to fight the legal battles necessary to claim me. Instead, he had done something else. He had built a legacy, piece by piece, acre by acre, with the intention of leaving it all to me when I turned 18. Every crop he planted, every improvement he made to the property, every dollar he saved was meant for the granddaughter he had never been allowed to meet. I thought about all those nights I had lied awake wondering why nobody wanted me, creating elaborate fantasies about secret relatives who would someday rescue me from the endless cycle of temporary placements and disappointed hopes. The reality was both more and less than I had imagined. Kevin Cox had wanted me, but he was gone. His love was real, but it came wrapped in grief and regret. The drive to Middlebrook County took 6 hours, winding through landscapes that gradually shifted from suburban sprawl to rolling farmland. Dennis had offered to accompany me, but I needed to make this journey alone. Everything I owned fit in a single duffel bag, a fact that should have embarrassed me, but instead felt liberating. I was traveling light toward a future I could not yet imagine. The GPS led me down increasingly narrow roads until I found myself on a gravel driveway that stretched for nearly a quarter mile. The house appeared gradually through a line of oak trees that must have been planted decades ago. It was a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, painted white with green shutters. Not grand, but solid and welcoming in a way that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The front door was unlocked, just as Dennis had said it would be. Inside, the house felt frozen in time, as if Kevin had simply stepped out for a moment and would return any minute. His coffee cup still sat on the kitchen table next to a newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle. Half the squares were filled in with careful handwriting. I walked through rooms that told the story of a life lived simply but fully. Photographs lined the mantelpiece showing Kevin at various ages, sometimes alone, sometimes with neighbors or friends. But there was one photo that stopped me cold. A young woman with my eyes and my stubborn chin holding a baby. On the back, someone had written Sharon and Michelle, 1978, my grandmother and my mother. The kitchen was spacious and practical, with a large table that could seat 8 people comfortably. The refrigerator was covered with newspaper clippings about farming techniques and weather reports. A calendar hung nearby, marked with planting schedules and veterinary appointments that would never be kept. In the living room, a stone fireplace dominated one wall, surrounded by bookshelves filled with agricultural journals and classic novels. Upstairs, I found 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom was clearly Kevin's, with a simple iron bed and a dresser topped with more photographs. The second bedroom had been converted into an office, with filing cabinets full of farm records and tax documents. But it was the third bedroom that undid me completely. It was decorated for a young girl. Pink walls, a twin bed with a handmade quilt, a bookshelf filled with children's stories. A rocking horse sat in the corner next to a toy chest that looked hand-built. This room had been waiting for me for 16 years, maintained with the hope that someday I might need it. I sat on the bed and cried for the first time since I was 12 years old. Not just for Kevin, who had died before we could meet, but for all the lost years and missed opportunities. For the grandfather who had loved me from a distance and the girl who had grown up believing she was unwanted. The next morning, I walked the property with a sense of overwhelming responsibility. 300 acres seemed impossibly vast to someone who had never owned more than could fit in a duffel bag. The fields stretched in every direction, some planted with corn that was ready for harvest, others lying fallow for the winter. A red barn dominated the farmyard, surrounded by smaller outbuildings that housed equipment I did not yet know how to use. The livestock were another revelation. 30 head of cattle grazed in the pasture nearest the house, along with a small flock of sheep and chickens that seemed to run the place with cheerful authority. A border collie named Scout had appointed himself my guide, appearing from nowhere to lead me around the property with the patience of someone accustomed to training newcomers. In the barn, I found Kevin's pride and joy, a collection of vintage tractors and farming equipment maintained in perfect condition. Each machine had a handwritten note attached, explaining its purpose and maintenance schedule. Even in death, Kevin was trying to teach me everything I needed to know, but it was the financial records that truly revealed the depth of his planning. Kevin had not just left me a farm, he had left me a thriving business. Contracts with local grain elevators, arrangements with neighboring farmers for shared equipment, detailed budgets that showed exactly how much money came in and went out each year. He had even set aside enough cash to cover my living expenses for the first 2 years, knowing I would need time to learn. The weight of his faith in me was almost crushing. Kevin had bet everything on the hope that his unknown granddaughter would somehow be capable of continuing his life's work. I had never planted anything more ambitious than a few herbs in the children's home's garden. I knew nothing about cattle or crop rotation or the 1,000 daily decisions that kept a farm running. That afternoon, I met Zachary Reyes, Kevin's neighbor and closest friend. He appeared at my door with a casserole from his wife and an offer to help with whatever I needed. Zachary was in his 60s, with hands that spoke of decades of hard work and eyes that seemed to see straight through any pretense. We sat on the porch as he told me stories about Kevin, painting a picture of a man who was respected throughout the county for his integrity and generosity. Kevin had never married, Zachary explained, but he had been deeply involved in the community. He served on the school board, helped organize the annual Harvest Festival, and was always the first person neighbors called when they needed help. Kevin had talked about me constantly in his final years, Zachary said. He had shown everyone the few photographs he had managed to obtain through private investigators, bragging about his granddaughter as if I were already part of his daily life. The entire community knew about me before I knew about them. The learning curve was steep and occasionally humiliating. My first attempt at milking the cows resulted in more milk on me than in the bucket. The chickens seemed to sense my inexperience and took shameless advantage, escaping their coop whenever I was responsible for securing it. The tractor stalled repeatedly until Zachary taught me the subtle art of working the clutch. But slowly, day by day, I began to understand the rhythms that had governed Kevin's life. Dawn brought feeding time for the livestock, followed by equipment checks and fieldwork that varied with the season. Evenings were for planning the next day's tasks and maintaining the detailed records that kept the operation profitable. The physical work was harder than anything I had ever done, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way I had never experienced. At the children's home, we had been given chores, but they felt arbitrary and temporary. This work had purpose and continuity. When I repaired a fence, I was protecting animals that depended on me. When I maintained equipment, I was preserving tools that would serve the farm for decades to come. The community embraced me gradually, testing my commitment before offering their full acceptance. Brian Hall, who ran the feed store, watched carefully as I learned to calculate nutritional needs for the livestock. Scott Anderson, the local veterinarian, patiently taught me to recognize signs of illness in the animals. Carol Powell, who had been Kevin's closest friend among the church congregation, invited me to Sunday dinners where I learned family recipes and local history. Each small success felt monumental. The first time I successfully backed the tractor into the barn without hitting anything, I called Zachary with the excitement of someone who had just climbed Mount Everest. When I managed to increase milk production by adjusting the cow's diet, I felt like I had unlocked some fundamental secret of the universe. But it was the letters that truly connected me to Kevin's legacy. I found them in his desk, dozens of letters he had written to me over the years, but never sent. They chronicled his daily life, his hopes for the future, his regrets about the past. He wrote about planting trees that would shade the house when I was older, about saving money for my education, about dreaming of the day when he could teach me to drive the tractor. One letter, written just months before his death, contained a confession that broke my heart. Kevin wrote about the guilt he carried for not fighting harder to find me sooner. He had been afraid that his interference might disrupt whatever stability I had found in the system. He had convinced himself that waiting until I was 18 was the right choice. But as his health failed, he began to doubt that decision. Reading his words, I understood that Kevin had been as lonely as I was. He had spent 16 years loving a granddaughter he had never met, building a life he hoped we might someday share. His love had been patient and constant, even when mine had been impossible because I had not known it existed. The first real test came in October, when harvest time arrived with the urgency of a natural disaster. The corn was ready, and waiting too long would mean losing the crop to weather. I had watched YouTube videos and read Kevin's notes, but theoretical knowledge felt inadequate when faced with hundreds of acres that needed to be harvested in a narrow window of time. Zachary organized a harvest crew from neighboring farms, a tradition that Kevin had participated in for decades. Farmers helped each other during the crucial weeks when timing meant the difference between profit and loss. But I could see the skepticism in their eyes as they assessed the 18-year-old girl who was supposed to coordinate this massive operation. The first day was a disaster. I made rookie mistakes that cost precious time, forgetting to adjust the combine settings for moisture content, failing to coordinate the grain trucks efficiently, misreading the weather forecast, and nearly getting caught in a rainstorm. By evening, we were behind the schedule, and I was fighting back tears of frustration. That night, Michelle Watson, a neighboring farmer who had known Kevin for 20 years, knocked on my door. She was tough and direct, the kind of woman who could run a farm and a family with equal competence. I expected criticism, but instead she offered practical advice and a dose of perspective. Kevin had made plenty of mistakes his first year, she told me. The difference was that he had been able to learn gradually, taking over from his father piece by piece. I was trying to master in months what had taken him decades to perfect. The fact that I was even attempting it showed more courage than most people possessed. The next day went better. I listened more and talked less, following the lead of farmers who had been harvesting corn since before I was born. Gradually, I began to understand the subtle choreography that made the operation work. The timing of truck arrivals, the communication between combine operators, the constant monitoring of grain quality and moisture levels. By the end of the week, we had successfully harvested the entire crop. The yield was good, the quality was high, and the profit would carry the farm through the winter months. More importantly, I had earned a measure of respect from the community. They had seen me work through exhaustion and frustration without giving up. They had watched me take responsibility for my mistakes and learn from them. Kelly Jones, who had been Kevin's accountant for 15 years, helped me understand the financial side of what we had accomplished. The harvest represented not just this year's income, but the foundation for next year's planning. Every dollar had to be allocated carefully, some for immediate expenses, some for equipment maintenance, some for seed and fertilizer, some for the inevitable emergencies that came with farming. The numbers were daunting, but they were also empowering. For the first time in my life, I had control over my own financial future. Success or failure would depend on my decisions and my willingness to work. There was no safety net, but there was also no ceiling on what I might accomplish. Winter brought a different rhythm to farm life, one focused on maintenance and planning rather than the urgent demands of growing season. I used the quieter months to educate myself, reading everything I could find about sustainable farming practices and modern agricultural techniques. The local extension office became my second home, and I attended every workshop and seminar they offered. But it was the evenings that truly transformed me. Alone in the farmhouse that was slowly becoming home, I began to understand the depth of Kevin's gift. He had not just left me property and money, he had given me a purpose and a place in the world. The girl who had never belonged anywhere now had roots that went deep into 300 acres of rich soil. I started cooking in Kevin's kitchen, following recipes I found in his handwriting on index cards scattered throughout the drawers. Simple meals that could fuel a day of hard work. Hearty stews, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden that I was already planning to expand. The act of preparing food in the same space where Kevin had cooked for himself created a connection across time that felt almost mystical. The house began to change as I made it my own. I kept Kevin's photographs but added a few of my own. I rearranged furniture to suit my preferences while respecting the fundamental character of each room. The bedroom that had been decorated for a young girl was transformed into a space that reflected the woman I was becoming. Still feminine but practical. Still hopeful but grounded in reality. Judith Lopez, the town librarian, became an unexpected mentor during those winter months. She had known Kevin well and understood better than most what I was trying to accomplish. She helped me research the history of the farm, tracing its ownership back through 3 generations of the Cox family. The land had been homesteaded in the 1880s by Kevin's grandfather, built into a successful operation by his father, and perfected by Kevin himself. Learning this history gave me a sense of continuity that I had never experienced. I was not just inheriting a farm, I was becoming part of a legacy that stretched back more than a century. The trees that shaded the house had been planted by people whose blood ran in my veins. The barns had been built by hands that shared my DNA. For someone who had grown up believing she had no history, this connection to the past was profoundly healing. Spring planting became an exercise in balancing tradition with innovation. I wanted to honor Kevin's methods while incorporating new ideas that might improve efficiency or sustainability. I decided to expand the vegetable garden and add a small orchard, diversifying the farm's income sources while creating food for my own table. I also plan to experiment with cover crops and crop rotation techniques that could improve soil health over time. The financial planning was equally important. Kelly Jones helped me create budgets that accounted for every possible expense and contingency. We established lines of credit for equipment purchases and emergency repairs. We researched crop insurance options and explored new markets for the farm's products. Every decision was made with the long-term health of the operation in mind. The second growing season tested everything I had learned during my first year. Spring planting went more smoothly, but summer brought challenges that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. A late frost damaged part of the corn crop, requiring expensive replanting. Equipment breakdowns seemed to occur at the worst possible moments. A bacterial infection in the cattle herd required immediate veterinary intervention and costly medication. Each crisis forced me to make decisions that would have terrified me a year earlier. I learned to trust my instincts while seeking advice from more experienced farmers. I discovered reserves of determination and resilience that I had not known I possessed. Most importantly, I began to understand that farming was not just about growing crops. It was about managing uncertainty and adapting to circumstances beyond my control. The community support that had been tentative during my first year became genuine partnership during my second. When my hay baler broke down during the crucial cutting season, 3 neighbors appeared with their own equipment to help finish the job. When I needed advice about treating the cattle infection, Scott Anderson spent hours teaching me to recognize symptoms and administer medication. When financial pressures mounted due to the unexpected expenses, local suppliers extended credit terms that gave me breathing room. This network of mutual support was something I had never experienced in the institutional settings where I had grown up. At the children's home, relationships were temporary and competitive. Resources were scarce and carefully guarded. Trust was a luxury that few could afford. But in this farming community, cooperation was not just neighborly, it was essential for survival. I began to contribute to the network as well as benefit from it. When Brian Hall needed help with his harvest because of a family emergency, I volunteered my time and equipment. When the church organized relief efforts for families affected by flooding in the next county, I donated vegetables from my garden and helped coordinate transportation. When the school district needed speakers for Career Day, I talked to students about modern farming techniques and the opportunities available in agriculture. These activities connected me to the broader community in ways that went beyond farming. I joined the volunteer fire department, learning skills that might someday save lives or property. I participated in the annual Harvest Festival, contributing both labor and produce to the community celebration. I even started attending church regularly, finding comfort in the traditions and fellowship that had sustained rural communities for generations. The girl who had aged out of the foster system with no connections and no prospects was becoming a woman with deep roots in a community that valued her contributions. The transformation was not just external, it was fundamental to how I saw myself and my place in the world. By my third year, the farm was not just surviving, it was thriving. The diversification strategies I had implemented were paying dividends, with the vegetable operation and small orchard adding significantly to the bottom line. The main crops were consistently profitable, and the livestock operation had expanded to include a small flock of heritage breed chickens that commanded premium prices at farmers markets. But success brought new challenges and opportunities. Local restaurants began approaching me about supplying fresh produce. A regional grocery chain expressed interest in carrying my vegetables. The State Agricultural Extension Office invited me to participate in a study of sustainable farming practices. Each opportunity required careful consideration of how it would affect the farm's long-term viability and my own quality of life. I was also beginning to think about the future in ways that extended beyond immediate profitability. Kevin had built this operation with the next generation in mind, and I felt a responsibility to continue that tradition. I started setting aside money for major improvements, a new barn that would increase efficiency, irrigation systems that would protect against drought, equipment upgrades that would reduce labor costs. The house was evolving as well. I had converted Kevin's office into a proper business center with modern technology for record keeping and market research. The spare bedroom became a guest room where visiting agricultural specialists and potential business partners could stay. The kitchen was updated with commercial-grade appliances that could handle the demands of feeding harvest crews and hosting community events. These changes reflected not just my growing confidence as a farmer, but my deepening commitment to this place and this life. The girl who had never expected to stay anywhere permanently was putting down roots that she intended to last for decades. I was not just inheriting Kevin's legacy, I was building upon it for the generations that might follow. The relationship with the community had evolved as well. I was no longer the outsider who needed constant guidance and support. I had become a full partner in the network of relationships that sustained rural life. When decisions needed to be made about community projects or policies, my opinion was sought and valued. When conflicts arose between neighbors, I was sometimes asked to mediate because of my reputation for fairness and practical wisdom. This transition from recipient to contributor was deeply meaningful to someone who had spent her childhood as the object of other people's charity and good intentions. At the farm, my contributions were valued not because I was disadvantaged, but because I was capable. My success was measured not by how well I had overcome my circumstances, but by how effectively I could grow food and care for animals and contribute to the community's well-being. The loneliness that had defined my early years was becoming a distant memory. The farmhouse that had once seemed too large for one person now felt perfectly sized for a life that included frequent visitors, community meetings, and the occasional overnight guest. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt peaceful, broken by the sounds of productive work and genuine conversation. The fourth year brought an unexpected opportunity that would test my commitment to the farming life I had built. A large agricultural corporation approached me with an offer to purchase the farm for significantly more than its market value. They wanted to consolidate several properties in the area for a massive grain operation that would employ modern technology and industrial-scale methods. The financial terms were attractive enough to secure my future without the constant uncertainty and physical demands of farming. I could take the money and pursue any life I wanted, anywhere in the world. For someone who had grown up with nothing, the security represented by that offer was almost overwhelming. But as I walked the fields that I had learned to read like a familiar book, I realized that money was not the only consideration. This land was not just an asset. It was home in a way that I had never expected to experience. The community was not just a network of business relationships. It was family in the truest sense of the word. The work was not just a means of earning a living, it was a calling that gave meaning to every day. I spent weeks considering the offer, discussing it with advisors and friends who understood both the financial opportunity and the personal stakes involved. Dennis Thompson, the lawyer who had first brought me Kevin's letter, helped me understand the legal and tax implications. Kelly Jones ran detailed financial projections showing what the sale proceeds could accomplish if invested wisely. Zachary Reyes and the other neighbors shared their own experiences with corporate buyout offers and their long-term consequences for rural communities. But it was a conversation with Michelle Watson that ultimately clarified my decision. She reminded me that Kevin had not built this farm to create wealth for its own sake. He had built it to provide a foundation for family and community that could last for generations. Selling to a corporation would end that legacy as surely as if the land had never been farmed at all. The decision to reject the offer was not difficult once I understood what was really at stake. This was not just about preserving my own security. It was about honoring the faith that Kevin had placed in me and protecting something valuable for the future. The farm represented values and relationships that could not be replaced by any amount of money. The corporation's representatives were surprised by my decision, and they increased their offer twice before finally accepting that I was not interested. Some people in the community thought I was foolish to turn down such financial security, but most understood that I was choosing something more valuable than money, the opportunity to continue building something meaningful with my life. The experience taught me that success could not be measured solely in financial terms. The farm was profitable and sustainable, but its real value lay in the relationships and traditions it supported. I was not just preserving Kevin's legacy, I was creating my own, built on the foundation he had provided, but shaped by my own values and vision. 5 years after that first letter arrived at Riverside Children's Home, I stood in the same fields where Kevin had once worked, watching the sunrise paint the corn tassels gold. The girl who had believed she was unwanted had become a woman who was deeply rooted in community and purpose. The farm that had once seemed impossibly vast and complex now felt like an extension of myself. Every acre as familiar as the rooms of the house I had made my own. The operation had grown beyond Kevin's original vision while maintaining the values he had embodied. We now supplied produce to restaurants in 3 counties, participated in regional farmers markets, and hosted educational programs for urban students learning about agriculture. The financial success was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that the work had meaning beyond profit. The community had become family in ways that went far deeper than shared geography or business relationships. When Carol Powell's husband died suddenly, I helped coordinate meals and farm work for her family. When Zachary Reyes was hospitalized for heart surgery, I managed his livestock until he recovered. When the local school needed funding for new playground equipment, the farm donated both money and labor for the installation. These relationships were not based on obligation or charity, but on genuine mutual care and respect. The girl who had grown up believing that love was conditional and temporary had learned that real family was built through shared work and common purpose. The bonds forged through helping each other through difficult times were stronger than any legal or biological connection. I had also begun to think seriously about the next generation, not just in terms of my own potential family, but in terms of the young people in the community who might be interested in farming careers. The farm now hosted internship programs for high school students and recent college graduates, providing hands-on experience in modern agricultural techniques. Some would move on to other careers, but others might stay and become the next generation of local farmers. This commitment to education and mentorship felt like a natural extension of Kevin's legacy. He had spent years learning everything he could about farming, not just for his own benefit, but so that knowledge could be passed on. I was continuing that tradition, sharing what I had learned with others who might carry it forward. The house had become a gathering place for the community in ways that Kevin would have appreciated. The large kitchen table that had once seemed too big for one person now regularly hosted planning meetings for community projects, holiday celebrations for neighbors whose families lived far away, and informal dinners where local farmers shared information and solved problems together. The bedroom that had been decorated for a young girl had been transformed again, this time into a nursery. The man who had become my husband was Scott Anderson, the veterinarian who had patiently taught me to care for livestock. Our relationship had grown slowly from professional respect to friendship to love, built on shared values and common purpose rather than romantic fantasy. Our daughter was born on a crisp October morning, just as the harvest was reaching its peak. We named her Sharon after the grandmother I had never met but whose photograph still held a place of honor on the mantelpiece. Holding her in the same house where Kevin had dreamed of meeting his granddaughter felt like completing a circle that had been broken for too long. Scott understood the demands of farming life in ways that someone from outside the community might not have. His veterinary practice served farms throughout the county, and he had seen firsthand how the rhythm of agricultural work shaped family life. Our partnership was built on mutual support and shared responsibility, each of us contributing skills and knowledge that made the whole operation stronger. The farm continued to evolve with our growing family. We added a playground near the house and child-proofed the barns and equipment sheds. The business plan was adjusted to account for the additional expenses and change priorities that came with parenthood. But the core mission remained the same: to build something lasting and meaningful on the foundation that Kevin had provided. Looking back on the journey from that first letter to this moment, I'm amazed by how much has changed and how much has remained constant. The girl who had aged out of the foster system with nothing but a duffel bag and a heart full of questions had become a woman with deep roots and clear purpose. The farm that had once seemed like an impossible responsibility had become home in the truest sense of the word. The community that had tested my commitment before offering acceptance had become family that supported and sustained me through every challenge. The work that had once seemed overwhelming had become a calling that gave meaning to every day. The legacy that Kevin had built in hope and faith had become the foundation for a future that stretched far beyond anything he could have imagined. But perhaps the most important transformation was internal. The girl who had believed she was unwanted had learned that love comes in many forms, not all of them obvious at first glance. Kevin's love had been patient and constant, expressed through years of careful planning and preparation rather than daily presence. The community's love was practical and supportive, shown through shared work and mutual assistance rather than sentimental gestures. I had learned that belonging was not something that happened to you, it was something you created through commitment and contribution. The farm had not just given me a place to live, it had given me a way to matter, to make a difference in the lives of others while building something valuable for the future. As I write this, Sharon is sleeping in the nursery that Kevin prepared 16 years before she was born, surrounded by the love and security that I had dreamed of as a child but never expected to experience. She will grow up knowing exactly where she belongs and why she matters. She will inherit not just land and buildings, but relationships and traditions that connect her to something larger than herself. If you are watching this story from your own place of uncertainty or transition, I want you to know that belonging is possible even when it seems impossible. Sometimes the family we need is not the one we were born into, but the one we choose to build through our own actions and commitments. Sometimes home is not where we start, but where we decide to put down roots and invest our hearts. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what this story means to you. Share your own experiences of finding family in unexpected places or building something meaningful from difficult beginnings. Your stories matter, and they might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The letter that changed my life arrived when I had stopped believing that anyone cared whether I existed. But Kevin had been caring all along, building something beautiful and lasting with the faith that love could bridge any distance and overcome any obstacle. His legacy lives on not just in the farm that bears his name, but in the family and community that continue to grow from the seeds he planted with such hope and patience.